So a quick reminder of where we're at. We're almost halfway through chapter 9. My goal was to finish chapter 9 today, but that probably won't happen. We will probably have to spend a little bit of next Tuesday going over the end of chapter 9. After we do that, or Thursday rather, will be spent doing exam review. So I'll do kind of a quick crash course run through chapters 2 and 9. Or we can spend the whole day on questions. I'll just leave it open for questions. If we spend all of Tuesday after finishing chapter 9 answering questions, that's fine with me. If there are only some questions, then I'll devote the remainder of that day to doing a crash course run through chapters 2 and 9. Additionally, on Tuesday, I will be telling you all roughly what the written question will be. I view the written questions on the test as basically little in-class essays. I mean, they're quite short, they're like 5 sentences, but you should be come into the test on Thursday ready to write the written. You should already have a rough idea of what's going to be on it. So we'll also be discussing that on Tuesday. So some housekeeping from last class. I forgot to show a video in the Chomsky versus Skinner section. So a quick reminder that B.F. Skinner argued that language was entirely a matter of reinforcement, that kids started off as blank slates, and then they were conditioned to speak effectively, whereas Chomsky believed that it was innate, that there was a specific language acquisition device that was built by the genes. There are various considerations that lend support to the idea of a language acquisition device, but one that I forgot to get into is the types of mistakes that kids tend to make. Often it's mistakes that tell you what's going on. And one mistake, and this is in the key terms, is overgeneralization. I'm going to show a video of demonstrating this. Overgeneralization is when you apply a rule in a case where it doesn't apply, specifically a grammatical rule. When kids are first learning language, they do this a lot. So a common example is the past tense. So in English, the standard rule is if you want to make a verb past tense, you add ed. Right, that's the conventional rule. But there are many irregular verbs in English for which this is not true. For example, the past tense of eat is not eated, it's ate. Or the past tense of fly is not flied, it's flew, right? There's various words like that. But kids often will say things like the plane flied, or I eated, or things like that. And those are words that they have never been reinforced to say, right? They haven't been rewarded to say he eated or the plane flied. What that shows, Chomsky and Pinker argue, is that kids are internalizing rules. They're not just being rewarded for the things that they've said. And to show this, we're going to watch a video of Pinker doing some experiments with young kids. All right, so that's a good discussion of overgeneralization, which again is just when you apply a rule in a case where it doesn't apply. One other thing I wanted to review because someone asked about it, so I thought maybe I spoke a little quickly on this subject, is just to quickly review what I said about pigeons and creoles. So just to be clear, the pigeon is the makeshift communication system. It's one that's just a few hundred words that was invented by adults just so they could talk enough to get through the day. A creole is what their kids speak. A creole is a full-blown language. So the pigeon is not a full-blown language. You throw a bunch of slaves together, they speak different languages, they have to make something up to communicate. Their kids hear that limited amount of input from the pigeon, and they expand it into a full language with its own rules, its own syntax, and its own rich vocabulary, much richer than the pigeon. And again, that has also been used to support Chomsky's idea of universal grammar, that kids are built with some degree of understanding of language at the beginning. Okay, so that's what we covered last time. We finished last time by starting the discussion of bilingualism and whether it is an advantage or a disadvantage. And I finished by saying that some of the early studies found that it was a cognitive disadvantage, that kids who were raised bilingual did worse on, say, standardized tests. But subsequent studies did something very important, which was they controlled for socioeconomic status. When you match kids by their level of socioeconomic status and compare ones who are bilingual and ones who are monolingual, you actually find that it's an advantage, that knowing more than one language is associated with various advantages, including advantages on standardized tests. So now we'll watch another video. We won't watch all of this one. I'll skip through it a little bit, but this is a video by actually someone who's an expert in Creole languages. This is one of the world experts on that topic. And he talks about various advantages that go along with bilingualism. So we'll watch some of that video as well. Okay, stop it there. So well said by John. He talked about some advantages like decreased chance of dementia, skill with multitasking, and then gave some examples of the richness in other languages, which may help to explain why it trains your brain to be better with things like multitasking. Okay, the next section is on the fact that it is easy. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Bilingualism has a chance to increase dementia. Can you say the same for pigeon?
Oh, interesting. So this person asked, if you didn't hear, if bilingualism decreases your chance of dementia, would a pigeon do the same? I don't know if that's true. I mean, people who speak pigeons are, actually, there's some places that still speak pigeon to some degree, but I would sort of doubt it just because it's much less rich than a full-blown language and presents much less of a cognitive challenge for that reason, so I'd suspect not, but that's an empirical question. Before I move on, any other questions? Okay, so as I was saying, the next section is on the fact that it is easier to learn a second language when you're young. The younger you are, the more your brain is like a sponge for language. It's much easier to learn a second language when you're younger. There is a debate about whether being young is associated with what's called a sensitive period or a critical period. These refer to the same rough period of time, so it's debated when it is. You might say under 5, you might say before puberty, but sometime in childhood is when the brain is most sensitive and most kind of ready to learn language. These both refer to that. The difference is, if you say that it's a critical period, then that means you think that you must learn a language before childhood, before the end of childhood, if you want to attain the competence of a native speaker. If you don't learn the language before that time, you may get decent at a language, but you can never achieve the fluency that a native speaker has. Whereas if you think, no, it's a sensitive period, that's more of a mild claim. You're just saying it's easier to attain full fluency if you learn when you're younger, but it's not 100% necessary. The book indicates that the evidence tends to support that it's a sensitive, not a critical period, but that's the difference between these two terms. These two terms are also sometimes used in debates about language acquisition in general, not just acquiring a second language. And in general, there it's thought that it's a critical period. When you ask the question, if someone doesn't learn any language at all before, let's say, age 5 to 13, they will never acquire language capacity. That's the standard view there. When it comes to learning a second language, it's more so thought that it's a sensitive period, not a critical period. Now, we take this for granted. Many of you probably already knew this, but it is kind of remarkable when you think about it, because if it was, again, as Skinner thought, just conditioning, or just a matter of normal learning, we are less intelligent when we're kids, right? We're less bright, and yet we're able to absorb language more quickly. This could be argued to be consistent with the Chomskyan view, because things that are biologically pre-programmed often have a set developmental timeline. They have to happen at a certain point. As I think I mentioned last class, puberty is like that as well. Okay, we only have one more thing, or actually two more things before we finish the language section and move on to thinking. So the next thing, second to last thing, is the linguistic relativity hypothesis. Before we do that though, I have a little activity, very simple. I want you all to draw something. And I want you to do it fairly quickly. I'm not looking for brilliant art here. It would be kind of hypocritical for me to expect that. Draw the following thing. A boy pushing a girl. You can do it in stick figure, I don't care, that's not going to be relevant. So just a picture of a boy pushing a girl. You will not have to show your picture, but I will ask for a show of hands about a certain feature of how it's drawn. All right, does anyone need more time? Okay. Show of hands. So look at the direction of the pushing. Show of hands, how many of you, the pushing is going from right to left? How many of you, it's going from left to right? Right, good. So, okay. Now, we're talking about language. Does anyone want to guess why that's the case?
Because you said the boy pushes the girl, so you said boy first and then girl, so you drew the...
You're on the right track, but what's the connection between saying boy first and going from left to right?
It's because we end up reading into the words from left to right. So.
Right, because in English, words are read from left to right. Not all languages are like that. Hebrew is the opposite. It's right to left. Give this problem to a bunch of Israeli kids, it's the opposite. They will draw the picture the opposite direction. This is an interesting example of how language can shape how we think, which is basically what the linguistic relativity hypothesis is about. The basic idea of the linguistic relativity hypothesis, which comes from two linguists named Sapir and Ward. The basic idea is that the language you speak influences how you think. Now, Sapir and Ward probably would have said that the language you speak determines how you think. That's probably too strong. The consensus nowadays is that probably they exaggerated how much language shapes our thinking, but there definitely are effects. We just saw one effect right here. Here's another commonly cited example. So in English, these colors we would, to a first approximation, refer to with the word blue. But different languages have different ways of dividing up the color spectrum. Some languages have very few words for colors, and some have more than we do. So there's no equivalent word in Russian for blue. There are these two words, goluboy and I think it's sini is how it's pronounced. And so they divide it up like that. And there's no real right or wrong way of doing it, it's kind of arbitrary. And you can show experimentally that Russian speakers are quicker at distinguishing these shades than English speakers are. So if you pair like two shades together, and you have to go like yes or no for whether they're different, Russians are faster if they're on opposite sides of this dividing line than English speakers are. We might take a little longer. So that's another kind of effect. There's lots of cute little studies like that, and I'll show another video of a scientist who specializes in this topic, talking about the ways that language can shape how we think. So very well said. So, as I was saying before, this is somewhat controversial. None of the findings she cited are controversial. There are clearly these kinds of effects, but just how much language shapes thinking is controversial. So, the TED Talk from before, that gentleman, John McWhorter, he's a critic of this view. He thinks that some of the linguistic relativity people exaggerate how much language shapes thinking, so there's controversy in the details, but there's clearly something to this. One example I'll give that may help you think why some people think it's an exaggeration. Generally speaking, when I learn new words from foreign languages, I never have the experience of, wow, my brain cannot comprehend this because it's a totally different concept. So one example, I'm going to teach us all, or some of us, a new word. Schadenfreude. This is a word from German, and there is no equivalent word in English. You will not be tested on this, but does anyone know this word? Schadenfreude, what does it mean?
Taking joy in someone else's pain.
Yes, exactly. So there's no word for this in English, but right away my reaction is, oh, there's a word for that. We already have the idea, we just didn't have a word for it. So there does seem to be some kind of common human nature underlying the different languages. So maybe language doesn't totally determine how we think, but there are these interesting effects, some of which she went over. Another example that the book gives is how languages deal with mathematics. So she gave one example. There are other examples. One that the book talks about is Mandarin Chinese. At least what the book says is it goes 1 to 10, and then starting at 10, it's 10-1, 10-2, 10-3, and so on. Whereas English, we have these really goofy things like 11 and 12, which actually measurably make it harder to learn mathematics. It used to be even worse. In Western culture, it used to be the case that we counted with Roman numerals, which made doing mathematics essentially impossible. Credit where credit's due. The current number system we actually got from the Middle East. The numbers we have are Arabic numerals. So thank goodness for that, because doing math with Roman numerals is essentially impossible. So that's another example of how the linguistic strategies that you use can change how you think. Yes?
So, for example, let's say we take the French language, right,
Mhm.
where they have, for example, you'd say 90, you'd say 4, 20, 10. Right?
Mm.
That, just kind of being able to be exposed to that, would that help you with your skills?
That's what someone from this hypothesis would argue. The book talks about Chinese and says that that's easier. I suppressed all my knowledge of French from elementary school, but if you agree with this hypothesis, you would predict that'd be the case. You'd have to test it, but I would suspect so. Okay, that's all I have to say about the linguistic relativity hypothesis. Any other questions? Okay, the final thing, I essentially have to talk about this. It's one of the famous things to talk about in intro psych, is attempts to teach other animals language. So there's a little section in the book on this. It's very cute. So how many of you have heard of Coco or Nim Chimpsky? Only a handful. So there are these really cute experiments with other primates, typically chimpanzees, gorillas, or bonobos, which are our three closest relatives. So we thought that was our best shot at teaching another animal language. They tried to teach it to speak, and that was essentially impossible. They don't have enough kind of fine motor control of their mouth and throat to speak. So what they did instead was they tried to teach them sign language. One of them has a funny name. It's Nim Chimpsky, which, yes, they did name it after Noam Chomsky. Chomsky argued this couldn't be done because language is a genetically built-in feature of humans. So to make fun of him, they named one of the apes Nim Chimpsky. So we'll watch a two-part video, just briefly some clips of Coco, who's a gorilla, probably the most famous ape they tried to teach sign language. And then I'll say a few things about it, about how to interpret these studies, and then we'll move on to thinking. So when I heard all the coos and the ahs, I thought, oh no, now you're all going to hate me. This could be ended. But still, an impressive amount of skill from Coco. Now, there is controversy about how much capacity Coco actually acquired. So, for example, the butterfly one, you can't help but think that that was being helped along a little bit. So someone like Chomsky is still a critic of some of this work, but quite clearly they are intelligent animals that can get at least some capacity. I will also say, so one kind of funny thing that was in Steven Pinker's book. So there you saw kind of Coco at her best, but what Pinker did was he took some random samples of Nim Chimpsky, who's an ape that acquired similar levels of capacity. And you take random samples of what they most commonly say, and this is what you get. This is kind of funny. So these are the most common things that Nim would say. Nim eat, nim drink, me nim, me gum, tickle me, nim play, me banana, me you give me orange, me eat, give me orange, me eat orange, me you give. I read this to one of my students in AP Psych, and they said modern day Shakespeare. So even in the best case scenario, they don't get much better than a 2 or 3-year-old human can. And that's after extensive years of conditioning. So I don't think this poses a challenge to the Chomskyan view, but it is still kind of cute. So that's the last thing I have to show for language. I couldn't help but remember when they were teaching him more, which was this. This is something I know because we actually taught Nathan a little bit of sign language, one of my brothers, when he was a baby. But we kind of failed because we wanted this to mean more, but it wound up meaning more Cheerios. So we would give him, because that's the first thing that he learned it with. So he'd be eating like grapes or something, I don't know, and then he'd be like, we'd give him this, and he'd be like, and it turned out the only thing that worked for this was Cheerios, but yes.
How did the researchers avoid giving cues to the animals?
It's a very good question. That's one criticism of this work. So I know there was a criticism of the work on Clever Hans, that they thought Clever Hans had all these cognitive skills, but actually they were just subtly guiding it. So the answer is it's very hard to know.
What about the case with like dogs now that are like being trained to like press the buttons for like certain commands? Like the reinforcement that it wants to press certain buttons, or are they actually understanding it?
Yeah, so I don't know the case of dogs, but I would bet that it's reinforcement. The standard ways of training animals are taken from Skinner. But the specific case you're talking about, I don't know, so I won't speak outside of what I know. Any other questions? As I say, this is the last thing for the language half of the chapter.
There's no more question.
Oh, sorry, yes.
Being reinforcement, does it mean to actually understand the language?
No, so someone who says this is just reinforcement would tend to be someone who says that they don't actually understand, because you can use classical and operant conditioning on very dumb animals. There's no way they have any kind of cognitive traits like understanding. So that's what they would tend to say, people who take that theory. Chomsky had one kind of argument about this, because some people were arguing that these studies into apes learning sign language could be used to study how humans learn language. And Chomsky said that makes no sense. That'd be like, so bees communicate via dancing. That's how they communicate information about where the flowers are. And Chomsky said, look, you could get a bunch of humans, like a bunch of human graduate students, and teach them how to do the bee dance. It'd be kind of fun to do, but you would learn absolutely nothing about how bees acquire language. I'm inclined to agree with that. Okay, so that's it for language. Now we'll move on to things. Okay, so I'll just start off with the basic technical terms. The book lists 3 basic categories of thought. Propositional thought, I want to get the order right, imaginal thought, and motoring thought. Basic difference, Propositional, of course, comes from the word proposition, which is a statement in language. So this is when we think in statements, like I believe Paris is the capital of France. I really want a burger. Those would all be sentences in my head. Imaginal thought is thought that is in terms of sensory images. Now, sometimes we use the word image to only refer to visual sensory experiences, but in the way that psychologists use the term image, they mean any sensory experience. So you can have an auditory image, a tactile image, or so it could be hearing or touch or any of the senses. So if you're thinking in some kind of sensory media, then that's imaginal thought. And lastly, motoric thought is some kind of plan for action. So we're thinking about doing something, thinking about moving, that would be motoric thought. Propositional thought is built out of concepts. So take the statement, the cat is angry, right? Terms like cat and angry would be concepts. They're the building blocks of propositions. One interesting feature of concepts in human languages is that many of them are very difficult to define and do not really admit of one-sentence definitions. We're going to do another little activity, and the difficulty of the activity is the point of it. I want you all to take an attempt, and I won't ask you for your definition, but try to write down a one-sentence definition of the word game, G-A-M-E. One of the simplest words, seemingly, in the English language, but write down a one-sentence definition of what a game is. Again, you will not be tested on this or anything, but take a stab at it. So again, I won't put anyone on the spot, but what we want, ideally, a good definition to have, is we want it to include all games and exclude all non-games. And that's what proves to be very hard. So it's very hard to make a definition that isn't too broad or too narrow. So a common first pass is to say some kind of competitive activity between people. But that would exclude some games, right? So it wouldn't include all games, because some games like solitaire only involve one person. Solitaire is still clearly a game. And okay, you could say, well, any activity that's fun, but now that's too wide. Now you're including some things that are not games, right? Certain things that romantic partners do are fun, but you wouldn't call them a game, at least not in the ordinary use of the term. So it's very difficult to come up with one-sentence definitions that actually capture what a term is. So one thing that helps us to get a sense of what a term is something called a prototype. A prototype is an example of a concept that is very typical of it, or a very clear case. So for example, a game like soccer, that's clearly a game. You can think of all the things that we refer to by the word game as kind of a cluster. They have some things in common, some things only apply to some of them, but they sort of all hang together. They don't hang together by one, strict definition with necessary and sufficient conditions, but they have kind of family resemblance. They have some things in common and some things not. But something like soccer would be right in the middle of the cluster. That's a really clear case of a game. Something like solitaire, okay, I guess it is a game, and we do call it a game, but it doesn't have all the features that games often have. Yes.
Can you define prototype?
Yes, so a prototype is a very typical or central example of a concept. So here's another example. Think of the word bird. So bird covers many different animals. Some of them, you have to pause for a second to remember that they're a bird. So if I say, is a penguin a bird? You go, well, yeah, but it's not a very prototypical bird. It doesn't fly, it looks kind of weird. Or an ostrich, right? Ostriches are technically birds, but they're not very prototypical. Robins, or blue jays, or crows, those are very prototypical birds. Right? They're more of what we think of when we think of birds. Okay. Any other questions on this? Okay, next we will talk about different types of reasoning. So these are the basic building blocks of thought, but then what we can do is we can take them and reason with them. There are two main types of reasoning. Now, we don't have time to go in as much depth as I would like, so the two types are deductive and inductive reasoning. If you take a philosophy class like critical thinking or symbolic logic, you'll learn about this a lot. I had to take whole graduate level courses in logic, but here we'll just kind of do a brief introduction. So the first type is deductive reasoning. One common feature of deduction, although this is not the defining feature, the book is actually a little bit misleading on this, but the typical cases of deduction involve moving from a generalization or a general statement to a particular. As I say, this is not the defining feature of deduction, but it's a common feature of it. And I'll give the standard example. If you've ever taken a critical thinking class, I'm sure you've seen this. So here's a deductive argument. Premise one, all humans, in the original Aristotle book it said all men, but it's 21st century. All humans are mortal. Getting a little bit of an echo. I'm going to turn this down. All humans are mortal. 2, Socrates is a human. And these first two things are premises, right? Premises are reasons in support of a conclusion. So the conclusion, C, therefore, Socrates is mortal. Mortal meaning will die, kind of an old-fashioned. So this has this feature, right? It starts with a general statement, all humans are mortal, and it moves to a specific statement, Socrates is mortal. As I say, though, that's not the defining feature of deduction. The defining feature of deduction is that the two premises, if true, guarantee the truth of the conclusion. They necessitate the conclusion, or necessitate the truth of the conclusion. Another way of saying that is, it is not possible for the two premises to be true and the conclusion to be false. Right? Just think about it. If these two things are true, this has to be true. You can't say that you believe these two, but you don't believe this. That would be a contradiction. That's a feature of deduction. It is the defining feature of deduction. If the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. And this is even true for silly arguments. You can make a really preposterous argument that is still deductively valid. So, let's say I said all I'll make something silly up. All cats have blue fur. Morgan Freeman is a cat. Conclusion, therefore, Morgan Freeman has blue fur. So that argument, silly though it is, would be deductively valid. Because if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. It just so happens that both of the premises are obviously false. But that would be an example of deductively valid reasoning. I mean, of course, what you want is a deductive argument where it has sound, valid logic and the premises are true. Obviously, that's the ideal case. Because that's deduction. Any questions about deduction? Okay, we'll actually be coming back to this a bit later. The other type of reasoning is inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning works in the other direction, and this is actually the defining feature of induction. The defining feature of induction is it flips this over. Inductive reasoning, you start with particulars. You could start with one, but ideally you want to start with more than one. And you move to a generalization. So let's say that I'm, looking at swans. I'm a swan scientist. And I get a couple dozen swans. I get a sample of swans. I'm like, okay, this one's white, that one's white, that one's white. And the swans in my sample are white. And I conclude from that, all swans are white. So I've started with particulars. I haven't looked at every single swan in the universe. I just looked at a sample of them. And I infer from that, all swans are white. Crucially, unlike deduction, the premises do not guarantee the truth of the conclusion. At best, all they can do is increase the probability that the conclusion is true. So I saw like 37 swans and they were white. I infer from that all swans are white. I haven't proven that all swans are white. Even if my premise is true, my premise being the 37 swans I looked at are white, that obviously doesn't prove the conclusion that all swans are white. All it does is make the conclusion more likely. Now, the philosopher David Hume argued that it can't even do that, but tragically for me, this is not a philosophy class, so I will not go down that rabbit hole. Now, there's good and bad inductive reasoning. It exists on a range. So you can engage in really lazy inductive reasoning. Let's say you go to Bulgaria for 1 week and you get mugged twice, and you infer from that all Bulgarians are criminals. That would technically be inductive reasoning. It would just be kind of lazy. You have a pretty small sample on your hands, but you kind of went wild with it and made a generalization on that basis. Okay, before we move on to some barriers to good reasoning, any questions about induction? We're good on induction? We're all going to, well, not we, I already know the answer, so you guys are going to engage in some reasoning. Imagine that there are 3 people. Paul, Linda, and John. And this arrow, I'm going to say, means looking at. And it doesn't carry over. The line has to be pointing to someone for it to be they're looking at him. So Paul is looking at Linda, but he's not looking at John. Linda is looking at John. John is looking at no one. Here's what you know. Paul is married. John is unmarried. Linda, we don't know. So here's the question. I'm going to write out a statement. Someone married is looking at someone unmarried. So this statement is either provably true, provably false, or you can't know. Do a quick poll. How many of you think that statement is true? How many of you think it's false? How many of you think you can't know? You are all wrong. So, with your neighbors, it's either true or false. Well, I know what it is, I'm not going to say. See if you can figure out why, or what the right answer is and why. So if few of you have opinions, maybe you can convince some people around you, because there is a correct answer. Check in, see if there's been some improvement. Okay, so we know that it's not unknowable. Who thinks it's true? Who thinks it's false? Good, so it is true. So not all of you have been convinced, but so here's how we know. And you all, whether you know it or not, engaged in a little bit of deduction, because this is something you can infer with certainty, given the information that I've told you. If what I've told you is true, we can know for sure that this is true. Linda is either married or unmarried. You can't be both, like you're either married or not. So if she's married, well, she's looking at John, therefore this is true. If she's unmarried, Paul's looking at her, and this is true. So it has to be true, no matter what's true. So there's a little example of deduction, but it's also an example of something for which there was a lot of evidence. It is often true that people reason better in groups than they do individually, if you set up the initial conditions right. This is part of what makes science good. Science, the success of science does not in large part depend on people being geniuses on their own. I mean, yes, you have your Einsteins and your Newtons, but often what makes science work is that it's a group process. There's lots of people trying to prove you wrong and reasoning with you and arguing with you. And we saw an example of how, in some cases, reasoning together can be more effective. Okay, so now we'll talk about some barriers to thinking properly. One that the book talks about is distraction by irrelevant information. This is a classic example. Your drawer contains 19 black socks and 13 blue socks. Without turning on the lights, how many socks would you have to pull out to have a matching pair? When you give this problem to people start thinking, oh, 19, 13, and that's distraction. the fact that it's 19 and 13 is completely irrelevant. It could be 1,000 and 1,000. The answer is 3. You have to take out 3 socks in order to have a pair. Because whatever the first 2 are, the third one's going to make a pair. Right? You take a blue and a black. All right, well, doesn't matter what you take out the third time, it's going to make a pair. Right? So no more than 3 times. I saw some puzzled looks. What?
They meant like 3 socks make a pair, and I'm like, who has 3 feet?
Oh, no. So you have to take out 3 in order to get a pair, for sure. In order to be sure that you'll get a pair. But some people don't see that right away because they get distracted by irrelevant information. Another example is the belief bias. The belief bias is when you ignore logical rules or get logical rules wrong because you have some kind of belief about the conclusion. So think about my Morgan Freeman example, right? If I was to give that as an example in a logic test, like in a philosophy class, you might be tempted to go or to say that the logic is invalid because you don't believe the conclusion is Morgan Freeman has blue fur, and presumably none of you believe that. And if you do, we'll be talking about schizophrenia in chapter 16, delusions, but most of you don't believe that. And therefore, you're tempted to go, oh, the logic is unsound, even though it is. So if you believe something about the conclusion, it can impair your ability to see the fact that an argument is still logically valid. The book gives another example. Here's an argument. All things that are smoked are good for one's health. Cigarettes are smoked, therefore cigarettes are good for one's health. The logic is valid. But it's very tempting to go, no, there must be something wrong with the logic because we don't believe the conclusion. What in fact is wrong with it is premise 1 is false. So that's belief bias. It's making mistakes about logic because you believe something about the conclusion. Another potential barrier is framing. There is a lot of evidence that people respond differently to information when it is framed differently or when it's presented differently. Probably the most well-replicated type of framing effect is risk aversion. People are much more averse to making a decision when the decision is framed in terms of risk rather than reward. So you get a sample, you randomly put them in 2 groups. One group you tell, let's say they both have, the group has cancer. They have some kind of cancer. You put them in 2 groups, and one group you tell them, if you have this surgery, there is a 95% chance you will survive. The other group you tell, there's a 5% chance that you'll die. Exactly. So, as you can probably intuitively guess, people are much less likely to agree to the surgery in the second group. Even though when you think about it, that's irrational, right? It's the same information, but when it's framed in terms of loss, it feels like a worse decision. And this generalizes beyond framing and decision making. In general, negative emotions feel worse than positive emotions feel good. This is sometimes called the negativity bias. I forget if I gave this example in this class. If I have, I apologize. But ask yourself, think about the best day of your life. I think I gave this in my 104 class. Think of the best day in your life. And then think of the worst day in your life. And here's a question. If a genie came to you and said, I'll give you a deal. You get to relive the best day of your life, but to do that, you have to relive the worst day of your life. Show of hands, who's taking the deal? 7 people. So for most people, negative emotions are much more aversive. And the standard evolutionary explanation for that is that things can go much worse than they can go well. if you think about things in evolutionary terms, what's the goal? The goal is to get your genes into the next generation. That's how natural selection shapes our preferences. So the best thing that can happen from the gene's eye view is, you make babies and raise them to be old enough to reproduce on their own. So, you have a kid, this is the best thing that can happen. But it's only good for now. It's not like permanently good. That kid could get hit by a bus, right? And it like,
Oh, I thought it said in-
so, it's only temporarily good. It's not, whereas if you get hit by a bus, you lose the game. You're out of the evolutionary contest for good. So we are sort of designed to be much more risk averse because things can go much more badly than they can go good. And even the good things we get are only provisionally good. They are not permanently good.
I don't know.
I feel like I'm depressing you all today.
Oh, like, what if it just turns out like, a drug dealer? Like,
Okay.
it's worse.
So that's framing. The next thing is on problem solving. We'll get back to the idea of deduction here. So in philosophy, deduction is standardly used to prove things. So this is not a philosophy of religion class, but for example, in philosophy of religion, people give deductive arguments for and against the existence of God. Right? They'll have some premises, and the conclusion will be, God exists or God does not exist. But that's not typically how deduction is used in science. In science, deduction is used where you start with a guess. You start with something you make up, a hypothesis, and you deduce predictions from it that can then be tested. That's the way it's used. It's used to either disprove something or to fail to disprove it. So you start off with some generalization. So for example, it could be all organisms have DNA. This is a thesis that relates to common ancestry, right? The idea that all organisms are related to each other. And what you would do with that is you would deduce a prediction. So this starts off as a guess. All science starts off as guesses or conjectures. And then you would say, if this is true, then amoebas, I don't know if it's amoebas or amoebae, whatever, I'll be lazy and say amoebas, have DNA. Right? If this is true, then amoebas should have DNA. Then you look and you see if they have DNA or not. And if they don't, so then you would do the test and you would either find that they have DNA or not. If you find that they don't, then you've disproven premise one, which premise one started off as a guess. It started off as a conjecture. If it disagrees with experiments, then you would say you've disproven the original conjecture. So that's the way deduction is standardly used in science. And the term for that is hypothetico deductive reasoning. It's a combination of two processes. The hypothetical part is where you make up a guess, a possible, something that could be true. Deduction means you deduce predictions from that guess. So in this case, you deduce the prediction that amoebas should have DNA before you go out and test it. And if what you deduced from the guess doesn't agree with experiments, then you say your original guess is falsified. It's not true. This relates to how the book summarizes problem solving. Right? You have some kind of problem, you generate hypotheses or possible solutions, and then you test them. That's the way in which you solve problems. And for those of you planning to go on in science, like say to graduate school, one thing that's often not appreciated is that this step involves creativity. We don't often think about science as a creative process, but in part it is. You have to make stuff up. You have to start off by guessing. You employ rationality once you test the guess and deduce predictions from it and collect data to see if it's true or not. Okay, next, I'll just give a little teaser because we're basically out of time because I have a video to show in a second. But what I'm going to talk about at the beginning of next class is the idea of mental set, which is basically once you have a track record of solving problems in a certain way, you become kind of fixated or set on it. You have difficulty changing and being flexible. So we'll stop there. We'll start with mental set next time, and then we'll wrap up the chapter and do exam review. Okay, see you all on Tuesday.